reaction made perfect sense to him, despite the fact that he had not noticed any such reaction to touching the girl when he had carried her into the inn upon their arrival. He decided that it was really Beth that he was attracted to. He had always had a weakness for soft curves, and the girl had an excess of those. She was who he truly was reacting to when he touched her brother. He was so desperate to believe that, he might very well have taken the girl to his bed, except that he was not interested in marriage just yet, and the girl was not the sort to be trifled with, especially not when she was supposed to be under his protection. He supposed he would just have to make a visit to a brothel once they arrived to London. Everything would be all right then. His gaze fell upon the boy sleeping in their bed, and he nodded. He would take Charles with him. The lad would probably appreciate the initiation into manhood. Radcliffe did not question how he knew that the boy was an innocent in matters of the flesh. He just accepted the knowledge. He also did not question why he was unwilling to strip the boy and prepare him for sleep. He simply turned and walked to the other side of the bed and began to undress himself. He had removed his coat and shirt and was reaching for the fastening of his breeches when he hesitated. His gaze shifted to the sweet-faced boy in the bed. He decided to leave his pants on and avoid a nightshirt that night. He did not question that decision too closely either, as he put out the candle, then crawled into bed, careful to arrange himself so that no part of him touched the boy under the linens. Radcliffe was dreaming of his last mistress, Lena. They were cuddled up in bed, wrapped in each other's arms. She was murmuring sweetly to him, her full lips brushing kisses across his chest, as she reached down with one hand to cover and caress his manhood. Sighing pleasantly, he opened his eyes and hugged the woman a little closer, and stiffened. The woman in his arms was not a woman at all. It was a sleeping Charles Westerly. The hand he had dreamt was caressing him was actually the boy's knee throwing over him with abandon as he slept. The lad was wrapped about him like he was a warm whore on a cold night, and worse yet, Radcliffe himself was responding to the proximity in a way that no whore would. He was as hard as a poker. Cursing roundly, he struggled out from beneath the boy in a fit of panic, gained his feet, and turned back to glare at the lad, as if it were his fault. Startled awake by the jostling and bouncing, Charlie sat up abruptly, glancing about with alarm. "What? What is it?" the boy cried. Charlie was barely awake, but had apparently caught Radcliffe's panic like a communicable disease and cast about for an explanation. The lad's first thought must have been that they had been robbed. Rolling onto his stomach, he leaned off the bed to peer under it, visibly relaxing when he spied the bag still there. Dragging one out, he yanked it open, then sighed as he saw that the jewels had not been stolen. Closing his eyes, the boy took a couple of deep breaths, then turned back to glance at Radcliffe, who still stood by the bed, glaring down at him almost furiously. Bewilderment, obvious on the boy's face, he rolled again onto his back, straightened the wig on his head, and sat up. "What?" Blinking, Radcliffe stared at the boy for a moment, then glanced grimly away. The lad was totally oblivious to what had happened. One look at the lad's lap was enough to tell him that Charles had not been the least aroused by the encounter, asleep or no. Turning his back to the boy, lest he notice Radcliffe's own arousal, he grabbed up his shirt and shrugged quickly into it, muttering, "Bad dream," by way of explanation. He finished dressing quickly, though he could feel the boy's bewildered gaze boring into his back. Once finished, Radcliffe snatched his bag and headed for the door. "Wash up, then wake your sister. We'll leave as soon as we have eaten." He closed the door behind him with a slam. Shaking her head over the peculiarities of men, Charlie glanced down at the bag she had dragged out from beneath the bed. Closing it quickly, she moved to the wash-basin to clean up, her mind going over the night before. She had been determined to outsit Radcliffe downstairs, then haggle with the innkeeper for the pistol. It would seem that she had failed miserably. She could not remember much of the later part of the night. The innkeeper had kept refilling her glass, and she had kept drinking. She had not meant to, but somehow every time she had turned around, she was swallowing more ale. She did not even remember coming up to bed last night. She supposed the fact that she had come to bed meant she had been unable to purchase the pistol. Sighing, She glanced briefly at the closed door, then tugged the wig off of her head. Scratching at her scalp with both hands, she moved back to her bags to dig out a hairbrush. Seated on the side of the bed, she tugged her waist-length hair out of the back of her shirt, undid the tie that secured it in one long tail at her neck. Then ran the brush through it. It felt greasy to touch, and she imagined it looked even worse. But she was not surprised. She had worn that blasted wig for 2 days and 2 nights, her head sweating something fierce under it. Still, that had not been nearly as uncomfortable as the tight binding around her breasts, and her hair itching at her back beneath the shirt. Charlie would have loved to release her breasts from their bondage, even just long enough to take a really deep breath or two. She would have liked to wash her hair and enjoy a nice long bath as well. But any of the above options were far too risky to attempt. Radcliffe could return at any moment. Thinking about the man made Charlie sigh unhappily. The fact that she had not managed to purchase a pistol or slip away with Beth had not really struck her on first awakening. Now it did, and that meant another day's travel away from their intended destination. Setting the brush aside, she retied her hair and pulled the collar away from her skin, far enough that she could slip the braid of hair back into her shirt. She could not say she was really sorry about being unable to escape. Radcliffe had been kind to them. She did not feel right about sneaking out on him in the middle of the night. A tap at the door made her stiffen briefly. Then Charlie quickly resettled the wig on her head and stood as the door opened, relaxing when Beth's head poked around it. "Oh, good. You are alone." Slipping inside, she moved to Charlie's side as she stood. "I was unable to obtain a pistol," Charlie began apologetically. "Good," Beth said abruptly. When Charlie blinked in surprise, she shrugged. "I did not really wish to run out on Lord Radcliffe. Besides, it has occurred to me that London may be the better destination for us just now, after all. Think on it. How much better would it be to arrive at Ralphie's with actual funds, rather than just jewels? And with Radcliffe's assistance, we are sure to get a fair price for Mother's jewels. Later, we can make our way to Ralphie's, if we must." Charlie's gaze narrowed at that. "What mean you by, if we must?" "Well," she pursed her lips slightly, "it does occur to me that we might like a coming out." "Beth! We could not possibly," Charlie gasped in dismay. "Why not?" "What do you mean, why not? The answer is obvious. The moment Uncle Henry heard of our appearance in London, he would— Why must he hear?" "How could he not?" Charlie snapped impatiently. "He would not hear if we did not give our true names," Beth pointed out simply. Charlie rolled her eyes at that. "Oh, I am sure that fake names would do the trick. Just exactly how many twins do you think there are in England, Beth? And how many of them do you believe at our age and likely to have a coming out this year? And how many have brown hair and midnight eyes? Why must we tell them we are twins?" "You do not think they would notice?" Charlie asked dryly. "Nay, I do not. Charles." Charlie stiffened at that, comprehension dawning over her. It was followed quickly by a pain that she hid by turning away. "I see. You would like me to continue this charade, so that you might have a coming out," she murmured unhappily. "Charlie," Beth whispered, reaching to touch her arm, but her twin jerked away. "'Tis all right." "Nay, you misunderstood. I thought for us both to find a husband." Charlie gave a harsh laugh at that. "'Twould be hard for me to attract a husband as a man, sister." "Not if we took turns at being one." When Charlie stared at her blankly, Beth explained. "We could switch back and forth. One night you be the brother and I will be the sister, and the next we'll switch. That way we can encourage whomsoever we choose. We can eventually tell the truth when we are sure of the men in question." Charlie stilled at that and faced her. "You would take turns at being a boy?" Beth nodded solemnly, her lips quirking slightly after a moment to ruin the effect. "Truly, it does seem that you get to have more fun as a boy, Charlie." "Fun? Her eyebrows shot up at that. "Aye. Well, just look. Yesterday, Lord Radcliffe took you shooting. Then, last night, you got to stay up all night drinking until you passed out drunk." "Passed out drunk?" Charlie stared at her sister, horrified. "Aye. The innkeeper's wife told me all about it. Her husband told her that you drank near a gallon of his grog, then passed out like a fish. Lord Radcliffe had to carry you up to bed." "Oh, no." Charlie sank on to the side of the bed with dismay. Beth watched her curiously for a moment, then commented, "You do not appear to be suffering for it today, though, do you?" Charlie blinked at her words, then glanced at her with surprise. "Nay, I do not. I feel right as rain this morning." Uncle Henry always complained of a pounding head in the morning after overindulging." "Aye," Charlie agreed with a grimace. The man had been bad enough to live with at the best of times, but he had been impossible while suffering a hangover. "Father never suffered the morning after, though, did he?" "Nay," Beth smiled brightly. "I do so want to try getting drunk." "Beth!" she chastised with more amusement than true reproach. "Well, and why not? You always have all the fun." Beth said the words teasingly, then sighed suddenly and admitted, "I do grow tired of being the sensible one at times, you know." Charlie started to protest at that, then recalled her annoyance of the other night when Beth had naturally expected her to come up with a plan that would solve all their problems. Those had been their natural roles. Charlie had always come up with one harebrained scheme after another, and Beth, with her sensible nature, had approved or disapproved. Should Beth disapprove, Charlie would scrap a plan. Should she approve, they had always carried it through. Charlie realized now that she had depended as much on Beth's sensibility as Beth had depended on her risk-taking and scheming. This was a nice change. "Everyone must try on a new pair of slippers once in a while," she murmured. Beth blinked at that. "What? Do you not recall the story that Mother told us when we were little, about the princess who had a lovely, soft pair of slippers? Her cousin came to visit her one day with a pair of bright red hard shoes with shiny silver buckles. They were obviously too small for the princess. Still, she insisted on trying them out, and wore them until her feet were blistered before giving them up to return gratefully to her lovely soft slippers. Mother said the moral of the story was that everyone must try on a new pair of shoes once in a while, if only to find that they prefer their own slippers in the end. I wonder if this is not exactly what she meant." Beth smiled. "Mother was very clever, was she not?" "Aye. So was Father," Charlie sighed. "I miss them both, very much." Sinking onto the bed beside her, Beth slipped her hand into hers and squeezed gently. "So do I." They were silent for a moment. Then Charlie stood abruptly. "Well, then we shall go to London, turn our jewels into money, buy a new wardrobe, and find ourselves a couple of husbands." Smiling, she glanced at her sister. "My goodness, Beth, I do believe you have come up with your first harebrained scheme. Think you it will work?" Beth shrugged. "It cannot hurt to try. We can always flee to Ralphie if it does not." Charlie nodded, then smiled. "'Tis almost too perfect. Radcliffe offered to keep us and introduce us as cousins last night." "Did he?" Beth's eyes widened in surprise. "That was nice." "Aye. Do you think we should tell him that we are both girls?" Beth asked, looking worried. "Not if you want to do any of those fun things a man gets to do." Beth nodded solemnly. "Then we must keep it a secret. So, when did you wish to make this switch?" "Now?" Beth hesitated, then shook her head and murmured, "Mayhap when we reach London." Charlie's eyes lit up with amusement at that. "Afraid to share a bed with Lord Radcliffe? He is hardly likely to pounce upon you as a boy." She smiled slightly at that, but shrugged. "Still, I am content to wait." "As you wish, Beth." The opening of the door brought them both around to peer at Radcliffe as he glared in at them. "What is taking you two so long? Come, we must eat and be on our way." "Aye, my lord." Charlie smiled at him widely, then bent to retrieve one of their bags from beside the bed. Beth moved to take the other, but Radcliffe was there before her. "I shall take that, child. Do not trouble yourself. 'Tis quite heavy. Come along. Downstairs we go. The sooner you both breakfast, the sooner we can leave. Tomorrow you shall enjoy the comfort of a carriage ride into the city."
"It sounds lovely,"
Beth murmured on the way out the door, and Charlie smiled at her gentle words. Aye, it would be lovely to enjoy the comfort of a carriage after the days they had spent plodding along astride hard saddles, the dust kicking up in their faces. It would be heaven. Chapter 4. Carriages were the invention of the devil. Charlie came to that conclusion within the first hour of the ride. She had never been far from home. Her parents had not been fond of travel and had preferred to spend their time at home with their daughters. Her parents had therefore only owned 2 carriages. The one they had been riding in the night they died had been destroyed in the accident that killed them. Uncle Henry had sold the other in this last year, as the family's money had dwindled. Charlie was grateful for the sale of the carriage now, as they hit another rut in the road, and she was nearly bounced to the floor. She would never own one of these infernal inventions. Grabbing at the seat, she ground her teeth together and prayed they did not have much farther to go before London. They had been travelling for what seemed like days, and she was positive, should they not reach the city soon, she was in dire peril of vomiting all over their esteemed host. She could not stand the airless little box the 3 of them were crammed into much longer. Catching Beth's concerned expression, Charlie forced a reassuring smile for her sister's benefit, then closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself anywhere but inside this hard, airless hack, bumping and jostling along the rutted road. Surely no one got into one of these conveyances willingly, she thought desperately, opening her eyes again and grabbing frantically for the door handle. Seeing her intent, Beth cried out in warning, drawing Lord Radcliffe's attention. Glimpsing the green tinge in Charlie's face, and the way she was scrabbling at the door, Radcliffe shouted a warning to the driver, relieved when the carriage halted. Charlie got the door open and stumbled out of the cab. She knelt in the grass to the side of the carriage and tossed her breakfast out on the roadside. Radcliffe appeared behind her. "Oh, my!" Glancing around at that dismayed gasp, Charlie saw Radcliffe take Beth's arm and urge her back toward the carriage. But her sister was having none of that. Opening the small bag she always carried, dangling from her wrist, Beth slid out a small vial and knelt beside her. "Here, Charlie, take this. 'Twill settle your stomach." Charlie took one look at the tonic her sister held out toward her, and turned to retch some more. Rather than be discouraged, Beth waited patiently for the course of vomiting to end, then pressed the vial on her sister again. This time Charlie accepted the vial and even managed to swallow some of the concoction. She then got shakily to her feet and stumbled back to lean weakly against the carriage. Charlie heard Radcliffe clear his throat. The man had turned away from the roadside and stood with his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for Charlie to regain herself. After a short time, he glanced at her questioningly. "Feeling better? Shall we get back in the carriage now?" Charlie closed her eyes at that prospect, groaned, then pushed herself away from the carriage to kneel in the grass again. Beth was immediately beside her, murmuring soothingly as she held her sister's trembling shoulders as she was sick. Radcliffe watched the brother and sister from beside the carriage and sighed. Things had not been going very well for the last 2 days. He had been suffering horribly from a hangover when he had finally managed to get the brother and sister to breakfast, and then to depart the day before. Much to his disgust, despite the amount the boy had imbibed, Charles had not seemed to suffer the same problem. He had been grossly cheerful throughout yesterday's ride, smiling and happily chatting away to his sister, while Radcliffe had felt as if his head was splitting in half. He had been more than grateful when they had arrived at the inn at which they'd spent last night. Radcliffe had immediately hired a messenger from the nearby village to ride into London and fetch back his carriage. He had then joined the twosome for supper before retiring early to bed to nurse his head. only to awaken in the middle of the night to find the lad once again wrapped around him like a second skin. Unfortunately, he had also found, much to his dismay, that he'd been quite enjoying the experience. Disentangling himself, Radcliffe had slipped from the bed and spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair, gazing fretfully into the fire. The experience had only convinced him more than ever that he must visit a brothel the moment he arrived in London. With dawn had come the arrival of his carriage. Unfortunately, the driver had hit a rut in the dark of his hurried journey, and had only just managed to make it to the inn ere the front wheel had split. After making arrangements for it to be fixed and follow them to the city, Radcliffe had gone to the nearby village to hire a carriage. This small, rickety old trap had been all he had been able to come up with. Riding in it was tantamount to torture. He was sure his very teeth had been shaken loose after the first hour. Should he open his mouth, every tooth housed within was likely to tumble right out. Now he had a sick boy to contend with. Worse yet, the boy's violent reaction to the ride was raising a rather similar response within himself. Radcliffe was positive, should he stand there another moment, he would be kneeling in the grass, losing his own breakfast. Cursing abruptly, he whirled away and paced off along the road in search of fresh air.
"There,
Beth cooed, smoothing her hand over her sister's back soothingly, as Radcliffe marched away. Charlie groaned as the last of her stomach's contents left her body, then collapsed backward away from the mess to lie on the ground miserably. After a moment, she opened her eyes to peer solemnly at her sister. "I am dying," she announced, stoically. Beth smiled faintly at the dramatic announcement and shook her head. "Nay, love, 'tis merely the travelling sickness." "Travelling sickness?" Charlie frowned. "What the devil is that?"
"'Tis what Mother called it. Father had it too. He could not bear to ride in an enclosed conveyance. Why did you think they did not care to travel?"
Charlie's eyes widened, then narrowed on her sister.
"Why are you not ill, then?"
Beth shrugged.
"I suppose I inherited Mother's more stalwart constitution."
"We are twins, Beth. Identical in every way, no?"
"Apparently not so identical as all that."
Sighing, Charlie sat up slowly to glare at the carriage. "'Tis that damned contraption. What a hellish invention it is."
"Aye, it is most uncomfortable,"
Beth murmured on a sigh, then glanced at her once more.
"Do you think you could keep down the potion now?"
Charlie nodded and drank from the vial Beth lifted to her lips. Hoping the liquid would settle in her stomach, she did not rise then, but remained where she sat, her gaze moving along the empty lane. "Where has Radcliffe got to?" Beth shrugged mildly.
"I suspect he has gone to find his own little patch along the road. He was looking rather green himself."
Surprised pleasure flooded Charlie at that. "Really? You need not look so pleased at the prospect," Beth chastised dryly, and Charlie grimaced. "And why should I not? The man has been a perfect beast to me for the past 2 days. Have you not noticed?"
"Aye, I have. I was wondering what it is you have done to the poor man to cause such irritation."
"Done to him? Why, I have done nothing," Charlie denied in surprise, but Beth's doubt showed and she frowned. "I have done nothing, I tell you. He woke up like that the morning after drinking with the innkeeper. I thought mayhap he reacts to drink like Uncle Henry does." Beth considered that briefly.
"That would explain his moodiness yesterday. But what of today?"
Charlie shrugged with a distant lack of interest. "Mayhap his hangovers last 2 or 3 days."
He..."
Beth began, pausing as a carriage came around the bend and rolled toward them. It came to a stop behind their own carriage, and an elderly woman, a young girl, and a man some few years younger than Radcliffe himself stared at them curiously from inside for a moment, before the door opened and the man got calmly out. A sudden indrawn breath from Beth drew Charlie's gaze. Her sister's eyes had become wide and rather dazed. Eyebrows rising, Charlie got to her feet, offered a hand to her sister to help her rise, then turned to face the man now, pausing before them. "Is there some way I may be of service?" the stranger asked, offering Beth a charming smile. Despite the fact that the question was addressed to Beth, Charlie was the one to answer. Her sister did not seem capable of responding just then. She was gazing at the man rather dreamily, and Charlie could not for a minute understand why. He was attractive enough, she supposed, frowning at his sandy brown hair and strong features. Her gaze dropped to take in his figure. Long and lean. Not bad, but not her sort. Kind of you to offer, but other than switching carriages with us, there is nothing you can do. When the man blinked at that rather blankly and managed to tear his eyes away from her sister to toss a perplexed glance her way, Charlie grimaced and explained. "We are travelling with our cousin," she said, stumbling over the words. "Unfortunately, his carriage broke down, and we were forced to rent this conveyance to make the remainder of the journey." The man peered dubiously at the rattletrap waiting at the side of the road, then took a step forward to glance inside, his eyebrows rising as he turned back. "Did your cousin remain behind with his carriage?" "What?" "Oh, nay, he wandered off up the road a ways for a breath of fresh air. He shall return directly, no doubt." "Ah," he nodded solemnly, his eyes returning to Beth once again. He seemed to hesitate, just as he would have opened his mouth to speak. The younger of the two women, a girl really, came stumbling out of the carriage and hurried forward to clutch at his arm.
"Goodness, Thomas, we must offer to share our carriage with them. They cannot rattle into town in that. It must be most uncomfortable. Do offer a lift to them, Thomas. Do." She ended her breathless little plea with a brilliant smile directed straight at Charlie. When she followed that up with a fluttering of the eyelashes that could only be called coquettish, Charlie shifted uncomfortably and suddenly found great interest in her shoes. The chit was flirting with her, for gosh sakes. Amazing. "Would you—" Thomas began, and Beth took an eager step forward. "Oh, that would be lovely."
Charlie grimaced at the breathlessness in her sister's voice and glanced up to see her and Thomas grinning widely at each other like a couple of star-struck fools. A sudden clamp of fingers around her arm then drew Charles' attention to the young girl who was suddenly pressed close to her side, smiling up at her from beneath long lashes.
"Shall we walk up the road a ways and find your cousin?"
There was a definite predatory look in those eyes, Charlie decided grimly, raising her hand immediately to disengage the claws clutching at her. "I would not think to trouble you so. I shall fetch him back myself." "That will not be necessary." They all turned as the man in question made his return known. "Radcliffe!" Thomas's surprise was obvious. "I did not realize that you were this pair's cousin." Stepping forward, he held his hand out in greeting. Radcliffe accepted that hand and nodded pleasantly back. "Mowbray, good to see you." "Aye. We came across your conveyance and stopped to see if aught was wrong. Your cousins explained that your carriage has broken down and you were forced to rent this rattletrap." He gestured toward the carriage in question. "We offered to share our carriage with you for the remainder of the trip, if that is acceptable." Radcliffe hesitated. His gaze slid to Charles, then to the girl who was even now slipping her hand persistently back onto the lad's arm. Noting Charles's annoyance and the way he seemed to be trying to tell him by his expression that the ride should be refused, he nodded solemnly. "That would be most appreciated," he answered, deciding it would be good for the boy to enjoy a bit of female attention, whether he liked it or not.
"And so, Mammon had a whole new wardrobe made for my coming out. She thinks I should be engaged in no time. What do you think, Charles?"
Charlie blinked at the tug at her arm and glanced at the girl rather blankly. Clarissa Mowbray was a slender, sweet-faced and sandy-haired girl, but she had not stopped blabbering since Radcliffe had accepted his brother's offer of a ride. She had rattled on about sundry unimportant trivial things all throughout the transfer of luggage, from the rented conveyance to the Mowbray carriage, pausing only long enough to make the seating arrangements. She had managed so that she was crowded onto the one-bench seat between Charlie and Radcliffe, while her brother was seated between Beth and the older woman on the other side. The older woman, as it turned out, was Lady Gladys Mowbray, the widowed mother of Thomas and Clarissa. The woman was hard of hearing, which had become obvious as Clarissa had shouted the introductions. It also explained why she did not rein in her daughter's chatter. Charlie was just miserable enough at that point to decide that Lady Mowbray had most likely gone deaf in defence against the girl's prattle. Charlie normally would have been ashamed of such catty thoughts, but she was finding it hard enough to breathe with all of them crammed into that small space, without the silly chit hogging all the air inside the stifling carriage to propel her witless gibberish. Charlie was positive that she was going to faint from lack of oxygen.
"I am sure he agrees with your mother's prediction,"
Beth murmured now, glaring at her sister for not answering immediately.
"Is that not right, brother?"
"Oh, aye, no doubt," Charlie muttered dryly, glaring out the window. "I do not recall ever having heard that you had cousins." There was a brief electric silence at Lady Mowbray's words. The woman had been silent as a stone for the past several hours of the journey, and Charlie would not have minded had she remained so. The woman's comment sent a shock of fear running down her neck. Turning sharply, she glanced at Radcliffe to see how he would respond to the question. Much to her relief, he looked completely unruffled, and even managed a small smile and shrug. "Elizabeth and Charles are second cousins to me by marriage." "I see." The way Lady Mowbray was peering from Radcliffe to herself made Charlie shift uncomfortably. She remained that way throughout the rest of the journey, fighting off the effects of travel sickness and avoiding Lady Mowbray's speculative gaze as Clarissa babbled on about nothing. It was a great relief when they finally reached London and were dropped off at Radcliffe's townhouse. They were greeted at the door by a tall, slender, grey-haired man who exuded an impermeable air of dignity. Radcliffe introduced him as Stokes, asked him to show Beth to a room and arrange a bath for her, then gestured for Charlie to follow him. He led her into the library, saw her seated, then spent several minutes outlining what he had decided they should do to prepare for Beth's coming out. Charlie listened impatiently, her mind distracted by thoughts of finally removing the horrid wig, stripping off her clothes, unwinding the tortuous binds, and sinking into a tub of warm, soothing water. When Radcliffe finally finished, she agreed to his suggestions with alacrity, and escaped the room to find Stokes waiting to lead her upstairs. He showed her to a room, informed her that her sister was in the adjoining one, and left her alone with a brimming tub of hot water. Charlie had just finally removed the last of her boy's clothes and stepped into the tub of water when the door suddenly opened. Gasping, she dropped under the water, submerging herself in an attempt to hide from whomever it was, only to come springing up, splashing water everywhere a moment later when someone tapped on her head. She was wiping her eyes and casting frantically about for an explanation when she recognized Beth's soft laughter. Irritation was Charlie's immediate reaction. "Do not do that," she hissed, glaring at her twin sister angrily. "I near to have a heart attack. I thought it was—" "I am sorry, dear," Beth managed to murmur through her chuckles. Sighing, Charlie relaxed in the water, her gaze moving over her sister's clean pink cheeks and nearly dry hair. "You were quick about your bath." She murmured, sinking onto the end of the bed. "I was so tired, I feared I might fall asleep in the tub. I rather rushed through it." Charlie nodded in understanding. She herself thought she might sleep in the warm, silky water if given half a chance. "Shall I help you with your hair?" "Aye, please," Charlie murmured, sitting up slightly as her sister knelt by the tub. They were both silent for a while as Beth worked on her hair, and Charlie worked on the rest of herself, removing the dust and filth from their days of travel. Then Beth asked what Radcliffe had wanted to speak to her about. Lowering her leg back into the water to rinse the soap off it, Charlie sighed. "He wished to tell me of his plans for us." "Which are?" "He sent a message to a dressmaker in town, a Madame de Caux, requesting her presence tomorrow to fit us for dresses." "Us?" "Well, you or me. Whoever is the sister tomorrow." She sensed rather than saw her sister nod in response to that. "What else has he planned?" "He intends on taking Charles, whomsoever of us that is tomorrow, to a jeweller to cash in some of our inheritance, then to a tailor to be fitted for new vestments." They were both silent for a moment. Then Charlie glanced over her shoulder at her sister and told her, "He also wishes to take Charles somewhere tonight. I thought, as you wish to take turns at being the brother, you would like to go tonight, rather than myself."
"Tonight?"
Beth's hands stilled in her hair, then pushed gently on Charlie's shoulders, urging her to lean back farther in the water to rinse her hair. Both of them were silent as they rinsed all of the soap out. Then Beth stood and moved to fetch a linen for her. Standing in the tub, Charlie took in her sister's frown as she returned with the linen and raised an eyebrow as she accepted it. "I thought you wished to take a turn at being the brother."
"Aye, but—"
Shrugging, Beth moved back to the bed to finger the clothes Charlie had dropped there.
"Not tonight, Charlie," she said finally. "I am ever so tired. 'Tis all the travelling, I think. I'm not accustomed to it. Could you go tonight?"
"If you wish," Charlie agreed, though she had really rather hoped it would be the other way around. She, too, was rather exhausted from their journey. Resigning herself to a night of carousing with Radcliffe, Charlie began to unfold the linen she held, only to stiffen and glance over her shoulder in shock, when the bedroom door suddenly burst open. Radcliffe had taken his own bath, dressed, then gone back to the library to await Charles. But the boy seemed to be taking an inordinate amount of time at his bath. Deciding to hurry the lad along, he jogged upstairs, then along the hallway to the door of the room Charles had been given. He was so impatient he entirely forgot his manners and burst into the room, mouth open to harry the boy into hurrying. The sight that befell him stole the words from his mouth and left him gaping, blankly, for it was apparently not Charles he came upon in the room, but Elizabeth. Naked as the day she was born, water dripping from her generous figure, she stood half-turned away, glancing back over her shoulder toward him, frozen in place, shock on her face, and a half-open linen in her hands. For a moment, all Radcliffe could do was stare. She was Aphrodite rising from the foamy sea, Astarte in all her glory. She was beauty incarnate. His eyes slid over the bend of her shoulder and paused at the sweet fullness of one breast as it peeked out from around her arm. Then his gaze dropped along the curve of her back, where beads of water sparkled in the candlelight like jewels on rosy velvet, next to the dark mystery of the hair that lay damp and smooth down the centre of her back, framed between her shoulder blades. Following the length of it down to the delectable curves of her behind, he took in the rivulets of water dripping from her damp hair and rushing down over those curves and along the backs of her thighs before returning to join the water in the tub. It was a path his hand suddenly itched to take, he realized, and recognizing the dark area his thoughts were taking him to, he quickly regained himself enough to turn away and face the hallway he was blocking. Muttering an apology, he pulled the door closed behind him and leaned against the wall beside it, amazed to find himself trembling. Charlie turned wide eyes to her sister. Beth stood frozen beside the bed, shock and dismay on her face. Muttering under her breath, Charlie stepped quickly out of the tub and wrapped the linen around herself as she hurried to her sister's side. "Quickly! Help me dress!" she ordered tersely, giving the girl a push to wake her from the frozen state.
"Dress? But he saw—"
"He saw you." Beth blinked at that as Charlie tossed the damp linen aside and snatched the hose from the bed to begin dragging them on.
"Nay, I do not think he noticed me at all. He was too busy ogling you."
"He was busy ogling you," Charlie corrected grimly, donning the breeches now, then turning to grab the binding to secure her chest. When a glance at her sister showed her looking confused, Charlie pointed out impatiently, "He will think it was you in the tub, Beth." Her sister blushed with embarrassment as she started to help her bind Charlie's breasts once more.
"But how will we explain what I was doing in your tub?"
Charlie considered the problem as she tied her hair at the nape of her neck. Then, catching the end of the long ponytail, she slid it into the back of her breeches before tugging her shirt on and quickly doing it up. "We switched rooms," she announced, grabbing the wig and slamming it on top of her damp hair before grabbing the jacket and hurrying for the connecting door between their bedrooms. "This is your room now."
"But—"
Beth began, but was cut off as the connecting door closed behind her sister. It took several minutes for Radcliffe to calm himself enough that he felt ready to face anyone. It was not seeing Beth naked that had affected him so. It was his reaction to her. During the last 3 days since encountering Charles and his sister, Radcliffe had felt nothing more than an avuncular affection for the girl. His feelings and reactions to the boy had been something else altogether. His body had responded to the closeness of the boy in his sleep. That had been distressing. And then, of course, he had begun to analyze every little reaction he had to the lad, picking apart every little increase in heartbeat and every little tingle the boy aroused in him. Now he supposed his own fears had been the problem, for the sight of Beth standing so gloriously nude had raised nothing but good, clean, unadulterated lust in him. The woman was as luscious as a mouth-watering roast duck all dressed on the table. Radcliffe was beyond relieved. He was joyous. He was not turning to the more unusual proclivities of some of the nobles who, having grown bored with their lives and a never-ending stream of wine, women and song, looked for new avenues of excitement. While he had always considered what a person did behind closed doors to be his own affair, he had never had any inkling of such feelings in himself. Now he knew he was fine. Smiling wryly at his own foolishness, Radcliffe straightened away from the wall and tugged at his cuffs. He had been so long without allowing himself to feel affection for anyone, he had quite mistaken his affection for the boy as something else entirely. It was most embarrassing, really. He was grateful he was the only one to be aware of his own foolishness. Shaking his head, he turned down the hall and walked to the next door. He started to reach for the doorknob, then caught himself and raised his hand to knock instead. The knock never fell. Even as his knuckles would have rapped wood, the door was pulled open to reveal a slightly out-of-breath Charles, standing there, blinking at him in surprise. "Radcliffe!" "Charles!" Relief still riding high within him, Radcliffe graced the lad with a more than warm smile. "I was just coming to see what had held you up." "Oh, so sorry, well, I did have to talk to Beth before I bathed and changed. Tell her of tomorrow's doings and all?" "Of course." His smile did not fade in the least. "She was not happy with her room?" "What?" "Oh, well, she preferred the other room. Blue is her favourite colour." The boy paused. "Why? Did you go there first looking for me?" "I'm afraid so. In fact, I fear, thinking it was your room, I did not even bother to knock, but merely walked right in. Most rude." Despite his words, he could not manage to look the least upset by the incident, though he knew the brother of the girl would be scandalized. Instead, the boy looked at him dryly and pulled the door closed behind him. "Well, I am sure there was no harm done. Was she asleep?" Still grinning, Radcliffe shook his head. "Nay. In fact, I fear I caught her stepping out of the bath." When Charlie arched an eyebrow at his tone of voice, he grimaced slightly. "I shall, of course, apologize at the first opportunity." The boy shook his head and followed Radcliffe as he led the way down the hall. Well, Radcliffe thought, the embarrassment of his having walked in on the boy's sister in the bath would quickly fade with the night ahead. It would be the boy's first real adventure as a man. They were about to go out on the town in London. Radcliffe wondered if Charlie had any inkling of where he would be taken. Mayhap he thought Radcliffe would take him to a gaming hall, or the theatre, or one of the men's clubs he had surely heard about. Charles had a surprise coming. They were going to a brothel. Chapter 5. The trip had been relatively short, but Radcliffe had insisted on their destination being a surprise. Charles had tried guessing as they rode through the dark London streets, hoping that should he hit on where they were headed, he might confirm his guess. But Radcliffe had merely smiled mysteriously and shaken his head at each guess he'd given. The boy had been beyond frustration, and went on the way to expiring from curiosity when the carriage had finally stopped. Radcliffe stepped out of the conveyance and found himself standing on a cobbled street in front of a rather uninteresting house. His confusion showing on his face, Charles had turned to Radcliffe. "Where are we?" "Aggie's," had been his unruffled answer as he'd started up the path to the front door. "Aggie's," Charles had echoed unhappily. Radcliffe smiled as he realized the boy had never heard of the place. The boy had thought they were going to carouse with London's young bloods. Now he thought they were going visiting, that this was the house of one of his friends. How incredibly boring. Radcliffe chuckled. "Come along. Do not dally." Radcliffe waited until the boy reached his side, then rapped at the door. He didn't know if that was the usual approach to gaining entrance to the establishment. He'd never visited Aggie's before. He had only heard of it. It was doubtful if there was another male in London who had not heard of Aggie's, though he himself had never favoured such places. He preferred the slightly less tawdry habit of taking a mistress and keeping her in style throughout the length of their relationship, to enjoying the variation, though less choice, quality of Aggie's girls. He could have hardly taken Charles to his mistress, though, had he had one at the moment. He was between them, in any case. The corpulent woman who answered the door could be none other than the infamous Aggie. Her hair was a brassy red, her face a map of the London streets with all its lines, and her body best resembled an overripe tomato ready to burst at the seams. Dismayed at such a presence, Radcliffe barely managed to conceal his shock and present a somewhat uncomfortable smile. "Well now, what have we here?" "Two fine gentlemen's come to call on old Aggie." "No need to loiter about on the step, me lords. Come on in. Aggie's open for business." Radcliffe was trying to decide if he really wished to go through with this when Charles shifted beside him, drawing his gaze. Remembering the reason behind this excursion, he straightened his shoulders and nodded. It was for the lad, after all. Best to get the chore done. Charlie gawked at the woman before them in amazement. She had never seen her like before. She was wearing a gown of bright red silk, though. Wearing was not exactly an apt description. It was more as if she had been poured into the material. Surely Radcliffe had made a mistake. This could not possibly be where he had meant to bring them. The driver must have got the directions wrong. Movement in the room beyond Aggie caught her attention, and she tried to peer past the woman. An impossibility. She filled the doorway like pudding filled a bowl, spilling out sideways toward the doorframe. As if sensing the attempt to see past her, the woman suddenly shifted, allowing Charlie a glimpse into the lit room beyond. What was revealed to her, then, was even more shocking than the woman herself. There were anywhere from 10 to 12 women beyond, and equally as many men. They were all moving about, laughing and drinking, and, good God, the women were near to nude. They were also of obviously loose morals. What else could one say about a woman who allowed a man to grope about down the front of a see-through gown as if he were looking for a monocle that had popped out and right down her top? They were most obviously in the wrong place, she assured herself, then gaped at Radcliffe as the woman moved aside, and he suddenly made as if to enter. "Come along, lad. You shall find this edifying." Not leaving her much choice, Radcliffe took her arm and dragged her in with him. Charlie felt rather like partridge pie at a party. The moment she was propelled into the room, half of the women suddenly swooped upon her. They were all cooing and murmuring sweetly about what a fine young lad she was, and how she would grow into a strapping and handsome man. They were also rather free with their hands, running them across her cheeks, over her shoulders, and down her bound chest. One even pinched her buttocks and commented on what a tight package she came in. The pinch was the impetus to knock Charlie out of her stunned state. Turning abruptly, she made for the door, only to have Radcliffe grab her by the collar and draw her up short. "Relax," he ordered, seemingly vaguely amused by the panicked expression on her face as she made an attempt at escape. He seemed a bit overwhelmed himself, but Charlie hardly noticed. With the women pouncing on her rather like a pack of wolves on a leg of lamb, she was looking for an exit. Radcliffe pointed to an empty couch along the wall and dragged Charlie over to it. He had barely pushed her into it when one of the women handed him a glass of some drink or other. Radcliffe immediately handed it to Charlie, then straightened. "Sit here and relax. I wish a word with Aggie." Before Charlie could protest at being abandoned, Radcliffe was gone and the wolves had closed in. The two younger ones were fastest. Charlie would have placed them as younger than herself had she any interest in guessing. She did not, though, as they hurried forward and dropped to sit on either side of her on the couch, each clutching at one of her arms and drawing it against their chests. She was frowning and concentrating on keeping her drink from spilling when a third woman dropped to sit in her lap. "There now," the woman on her lap cooed, wrapping her arms firmly about Charlie's neck. "I'm thinking you and I could be fine friends." "You're thinking wrong, then," the girl on Charlie's right muttered bitterly. "You know Aggie likes to keep all the little virgin boys for herself." "Aggie's a nasty old cow," the woman on her lap snapped irritably, then smiled sweetly at Charlie and cooed. "You'd rather have me than that paunchy old harpy, wouldn't ye? Look what I've got for ye. Aggie doesn't have anything as tasty as these." The woman tugged her almost see-through top downward with one hand, baring her breasts as she began to exert a gentle but inexorable pressure on the back of Charlie's neck with her other hand. Charlie stared horrified at the woman's breasts as they drew closer. To her, they appeared as two swollen, pale-pink orbs bent on suffocating her as they neared her face. "You're not the only one around here with something to offer." Before Charlie could be smothered by those massive breasts, she felt the hand of the woman on her left slip between her and the woman on her lap. The hand slid down toward her crutch. Crying out in dismay, Charlie leapt abruptly to her feet, depositing Miss Bared Breasts on the floor just as Radcliffe appeared before her. "Thank God!" she gasped, completely forgetting the charade she was playing at and throwing herself against the man's chest. "Get me out of here, Radcliffe, now!" Radcliffe's first reaction was to wrap his arms protectively around her. Then, frowning, he pushed her away instead. "Act your age, Charles. They are naught but a bunch of women. Do you not find any of them attractive?" "Attractive? They are she-wolves!" Charlie glared at him coldly. "I want to go home. Now." Grunting, Radcliffe frowned, his gaze moving to the women in question. He seemed to consider her words, then murmured something about Aggie being right, and it being worth a gamble. Upset as she was when Radcliffe said, "Come along," relief rushed through her. She followed him out of the room to where the old whore Aggie waited by the stairs with a younger female. They were going to pass up the establishment's more lascivious offerings for some gambling, was her conclusion. She was so relieved by this realization that she followed eagerly when the older woman turned and led her up the stairs. Radcliffe and the other woman followed. At the top of the stairs, Aggie took a right and led them down a long hallway, then directly into the third room along the hall. Charlie followed her in and stepped past the waiting woman to peer around the room. A huge bed screamed for attention as she entered. Its covers and drapes were a brilliant blood red. It looked rather vulgar to Charlie. Other than that, there was a chest, a chair, and a wardrobe. There were no tables with men seated playing cards, no baccarat tables, nothing in the way of gambling at all. The slam of the door behind her drew her head around to see that Radcliffe was no longer with them. She was alone with the old crone who had answered the door. "Here we are, lovey. Let's get to it, then." Charlie's eyes widened, and she took an abrupt step backward, quickly catching the other woman's hands as she reached out to undo her cravat. "What do you think you're doing?" "Helping you to undress, son." "Why on earth would you think to do a thing like that?" she asked shortly, redoing the difficult tie. The woman's lips quirked in amusement. "'Tis difficult to do with your clothes on, lad." "There is nothing we are like to do that I need remove my clothes for," Charlie assured her, stepping stiffly toward the door. She had barely taken a step when Aggie caught her arm and whirled her back around. "Oh, you like it like that, do ye? Quick, and with your clothes still on," she murmured, insinuatingly, reaching down to cup Charlie at the juncture between her legs. Gasping in horror, Charlie jumped back from the touch, but that was as far as she got. The woman was still holding her arm. "My, you are a small one, are ye now? I did not even feel ye," she exclaimed, turning her attention and hands back to removing Charlie's cravat. "Well, 'tis a handicap, that, but not insurmountable. Old Aggie'll show you how to overcome it." "Overcome it?" Scowling, Charlie tried to push her hands away and refasten her tie. "Aye, trust me. The saying is true. 'Tis not the size of the sail, but the way you handle the jib that decides the ride. You feeling all right, boy? You looking peaked all of a sudden." "Oh, dear Lord!" Whirling, Charlie ran for the door, but before she could open it, she was caught by the arm and dragged backward toward the bed. Now, lad. No need to panic. Aggie'll be gentle." "I do not want you to be gentle." She managed, tugging desperately at her arm. Much to her relief, Aggie stopped at that and turned to arch one eyebrow at her. "You don't?" "Nay." She shook her head frantically. "I do not—" "Well, why did ye no say something?" "Well, that explains everything. I was starting to worry. You were acting so odd." Shaking her head, she moved toward the wardrobe beside the door to riffle through, muttering, "Well now, Lord Radcliffe, he said you were inexperienced, but 'tis obvious you're not, and you know what you want." "Aha!" Charlie was still blinking over the first part of her statement when the woman grunted in satisfaction, withdrew from the wardrobe, and turned toward her, rope in one hand and a long, evil-looking whip in the other. "There. Now that I ken what you're like, we can get down to business." Smiling sweetly, she cracked the whip. Charlie bolted for the door. She had barely taken 2 steps, however, when the snap of the whip preceded something tangling around her feet and drawing tight. Crying out, she threw her hands out to break her fall as she stumbled forward onto her stomach. "Now there's a naughty boy for ye," the hag crooned, catching her by the collar and dragging her back toward the bed. "We'll have to spank that naughtiness out, I think." Charlie thought not, and began to struggle in earnest as the woman sank onto the side of the bed and tried to draw her over her knee. Breaking loose, she turned away, only to be caught about the waist and thrust onto the bed on her back. Before she could move, the woman had crawled to sit upon her chest. Snatching up the rope she had tossed onto the bed earlier, the woman quickly tied Charlie down, each wrist to its own bedpost. "There!" The woman gave a sigh of satisfaction, then blew the hair that had come loose on her forehead out of her face. She eyed Charlie with a bit of exasperation. "You're a lively one, you are. I'm getting too old for these games. I'd best get a huge tip out of this." When Charlie merely stared at her dumbly, she sighed and leaned to the side. "Here now." Her smile was sprightly as she straightened again, whip in hand, fondling the grip suggestively. "Is it just a threat, or a pain you like, or will you be wanting the real thing?" "Tell me more about this, Aggie. She will be gentle with the boy, will she not?" The strumpet's hair almost hid the way she rolled her eyes at his question. She was likely frustrated, too. Radcliffe had been fretting over the boy ever since they had entered the room. He was most annoying. He was entirely too preoccupied with that damn boy. She had been cooing and petting him for several moments now, and he was not even hard. He couldn't concentrate. "Aggie will be most gentle, my lord," the woman murmured huskily, raising her eyes to cast him an alluring look as she continued working on the buttons of his shirt. "She has been in the business a long time. She'll break him in proper and with care." "Aye, of course she will." Radcliffe forced a smile and tried to concentrate on the woman's attentions as she finished with the buttons of his shirt and slid her hands across his chest. Still, it was most difficult. He could not get the boy out of his head. It was rather like an annoying hangnail, irritating, and nagging. Grimacing at his own foolishness, he raised his hands to her shoulders and drew the woman up for a kiss, trying to work up some enthusiasm. A loud scream brought an end to his efforts, making his head whip toward the wall. There was no mistaking the panic and pain in that shriek as belonging to Charles. Cursing, Radcliffe pushed the woman away from him and hurried for the door. He was crashing through the door of the room Charles was in before that